Alright, so on this stick animation, I'm going to go over how to render it, but just a couple tips for making it a little bit more fluid and a little bit more natural looking. I'm going to grab all of these. And last class, we went over going through the dope sheet and just offsetting all of these like 1 or 2 frames or 3 frames or whatever it turns out to be, okay? Now keep in mind that nothing in the real world acts like in sync like that, right? There's always something that's going to cause it to act more or less or whatever. So feel free when you're working with this that you don't always have to get every single one to be exact. Sometimes we can go 2 on this one and maybe 3 on that one and keep that one back there maybe or lined up. Okay, so it doesn't always have to be like everything is always stair-steppy, okay? In that same respect, if we go to the graph editor for these, all of these are all exactly the same. So again, don't be afraid to go through and give them a little bit of tweak vertically. In the dope sheet, we tweak them horizontally so they're offset a little bit. So in here, we could also grab these and give them each their own like little movement up or down. And again, it's not going to be a huge difference as far as what the numbers are, but it'll just feel a little bit more natural to us.
That's actually what I was going to bring up as I was.
Okay. So again, don't be afraid to just go in there and start playing with them. Even the tangents, you can kind of grab some of the tangents and just kind of tweak those too. And again, it's nothing huge. It's all little things that will just kind of add up to giving them all kind of like their own feel. Maybe just to kind of throw some ideas out there, maybe this guy right here at the bottom, he was a little bit too close to some water, so maybe his joint is a little bit rustier, so he doesn't move as freely as the one above it, okay? Or maybe there was oil dripping on the very top one, and that one goes crazy, but the other ones don't move as smoothly. So you got to think about this in a real-world situation of how do these things actually behave, and nothing behaves exactly the same throughout, okay?
At any point in time, will we be adding sound effects to at least help it read better?
You can do that as well. The requirement is just this guy, little wiggle at the end, and then background, render, nice, whatever. Your extra going beyond could be adding sound effects, adding a little ball interacting with it.
Okay, so we can't even do that in this.
Right.
This was just kind of like a beginner to get us warmed up, and then boom, we're getting into something.
No, this is it.
Okay.
Okay, this is our very first one. All right, so that just keep those things in mind as you're working on this, that we can expand it more and do different things with the exact same principles, okay? This isn't just like one thing that we would use this for. All right, so now we're at the rendering stage of this, and going back to our animation principles, or the 12 principles of animation, consider what the last couple were. Staging, right? That was an important one, and appearance and solid drawing. Those all matter in making this part very, very important. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to build my background. And there's a bunch of different ways that you can do this. I'm going to show a couple different ways. So one way that we can do this is just by having just a flat plane, oops, like this. Now for this specific type of animation, my camera wants to be on this side, okay? It's very boring, but my camera wants to be on this side for this type of animation. Mainly because your instructor is going to be grading these, and if you kind of Tarantino it and you get right up on these things,
right,
you know, it may look wonderful, but I can't see what's going on. I can't see that swing inside there.
Sure.
So we're going to go to the side, and it's going to be a very boring view, but I don't care, okay? So now we're going to consider what else is in the scene. So we have the ground so that we would have something for a shadow to fall on or reflections to go on. The background that's way back there is completely black. So if I were to render this, you see it stands out, but that black is just too darkening. So I definitely don't want to just leave it just as a black back there. So I can duplicate this ground. I can rotate the ground. And that will give me somewhat of a stage that I could use. Now the colors are not very good. It's gray on gray, so we're not really seeing much there. But in the end, this would look a bit better, okay? Having some sort of background there. Now to take it a step further, instead of just doing that, I can grab this edge here and extrude it.
You know what? I want to know that. Quick. How do you do that?
The quick key, shift right click.
Okay.
And then I can hit 3, and now I get a seamless backdrop, okay? The other one had a seam to it. It looked, you know, like there was an opening. Or yeah. This one, there is none. So this one will have a nice little transition that's going to ride up the back of it. Okay? So that's what that little thing is. Or you could do something different. The idea is the background is exactly that. It's a background. It's meant to complement and help support what's in front. It's supposed to make that kind of show off a little bit better. So we don't want anything that's going to be super strong. When we have that border there, that hard edge can really detract from it because it's just like too sharp. This is, I prefer that. Looks a little bit nicer. All right, so now that we have this, then I can do some lighting. So for my lights, you should try to stick to area lights because they're typically, for what we're going to be doing, just kind of showing off animations, they're typically a better light, okay? So area light, I'm going to make it big. And I'm going to double light this. I'm going to have 2 lights from the front. I'm not going to show this from the back. So I'm just going to put this light right here, right there. I'm going to set this to be a decayed light, so I go to quadratic. I set my intensity to like 1,000 or so, and I tell it under mental ray area light to use the light shape. And I set my samples to 1, and then I zoom in, and then I render it. Okay?
Is 1 a simple on and off?
1 means mental ray is going to take care of it all. Okay? If you were to set it to 0, then it would be at 0.
What if it was at 55?
Then it would be set to 55 samples.
Oh,
okay? So 1 just means let mental ray manage all of the lighting scenario sampling. All right, so at 1,000, I get nothing in my scene. So let me take it up to 10,000. Almost there. Let's turn it up to 100,000. Yeah, we're getting something. Let's take it up to 500,000. It's insane. All right, now we're getting actually some light. Okay, now again, we don't want this to be pitch black in the background. We don't want it to be super white. It's complementing it. So just right here with my gray there and my background being gray, it actually pulls it out a bit further. Okay. Now the other thing that I have to be concerned about is not just this guy here, but this. See that shadow right there? Sometimes people put in too many lights, and now we have all these shadows, and the shadows are now competing for our attention because they're doing more movement than the object is. So again, we kind of watch out for that. Now I can make my shadow softer by making my light bigger. So I do that, and now I have a bigger light, bigger shadow, okay? Which typically means a softer shadow. So again, we click and we wait and watch. There we go. Okay? Now there is more grain on the screen because everything is kind of spread out. All those samples are spread out. I don't care about that at this point. We're just looking at values. We're just looking at how bright things are. I'm going to make this a little bit brighter even. Let's take it up to 1,000,000 just to see. And I'll even do like a little sample right here. There we go. So it looks like we're good. Okay, so that looks like it's pretty decent. So now I can go in and start giving it some textures. So I'm going to go to the background. I'm going to assign a new material. I'm going to go to mental ray and assign a Mia. And this is just going to be background Mia. And I'm going to use the presets and go to matte finish, replace. I'm going to go with something in this realm, just something that's kind of like manila foldery. Okay. Then I'm going to go to my platform and I'm going to texture my platform. Okay, I'll assign a Mia to it. And this is going to be this dark blue. Very little reflection on this. And then glossy samples of 1. Now this glossy samples of 1 does the same thing as the lighting samples of 1. Okay, just letting mental ray take care of it. Now this and this, these are kind of like the little parts that are holding it on. I could texture those differently, but I think I want to just texture all of these parts the same, and then let the little bolts in the middle be colored differently. So I'm going to grab all those. I'm going to go to my Mia planks, and I'm going to grab this blue again, and I'm just going to shove the blue over to a different color. Maybe this yellowy color. Or maybe I'll make this a little bit more saturated, 0.14. Or a little more valued. There we go. Take this. There we go. And then I'll take these little things here.
Trinkets and doodads.
I'll assign a Mia to them. And I'm using the same color, so I always refer back to one of my original colors, and then I just choose my color from there.
What does that do?
It just kind of creates more color harmony, okay? Because we're using basically the same or pretty close to the same saturation and pretty close to the same value. If I just went in there and just randomly grabbed 3 different colors,
Right.
they're going to be too far apart.
I didn't know that. That's
Yeah.
awesome. Thank you.
So let's try that and see how that's going to work, okay? All right, so there's that. Let's render it.
Oh, she's pretty.
All right, now the grain is kind of overtaking this, so I may fix the grain for a second. But the other thing is that I have my reflectivity way up high in this. Let me pull that down. And I think I want to knock down this to 0.07. There we go. There we go. So now I can read those bolts a little bit better. So it makes my pivoting a little bit more obvious of where it's pivoting from. There's bolts there. That's what's causing the pivoting. So it makes a little bit more sense. All right. So now my next step in this is just kind of looking at it at different stages. So something like that. Let me just see what it looks like. All right, that looks pretty good. Now I have to keep in mind that the underside of this is coming out pretty dark. So then I have to say, okay, well maybe I don't want to render it like this because I'm seeing the underside of it. Maybe I want to render it like that. Okay? So it's another staging element of how we're staging this as to what shows up. Okay, so let's go there and render it and see how that looks. It definitely looks a lot better having this platform a bit more visible that we can see it. Okay, I think I want to also take this background and just knock down the brightness, or knock the brightness up a little bit. Yeah, so it's a little bit brighter. That pops out a little bit more. All right, now the other thing I want to look at is this right now is just looking a little bit too bland. Okay, we have motion on this thing, but it's not really coming across as being very quick. So one thing we can do is turn on what's called motion blur. So under quality, unless they moved it, geometry, legacy. There it is. Under scene, that's where it's at now, they have motion blur. And there's 2 kinds of motion blur. One of them is no deformation. The other one is full, okay? Now this will, again, depend on what you're doing with your scene and what objects are moving as to what you want to do. If we had a person animated, they would be on full motion blur because the vertices are moving around and that's what we would be blurring, okay? So typically anything that you're deforming a surface is going to get full deformation or full motion blur. Everything else would get no deformation. Okay? So here, we're simply rotating geometry and translating geometry. So in this case, there's no deformation happening. Okay? Now this is important because when we do other assignments, we are going to have some objects that will be solid objects that just move, and other ones which are organic objects that are deforming. Okay? If you're in doubt, you can leave this at full, and it'll just take longer. But for this case, we want no deformation. So then we have a couple other settings here. Motion blur by, keyframe location, and motion steps. So the motion blur by is how many frames we're blurring this by. So if we have our object going from here to here over one frame, that's a lot of blur happening. If we have our object going from here to here over one frame, that's not a lot of blur happening, and we may want to enhance it by having it blur over several frames. Okay? So a lot of this is going to be, again, we eyeball it and just kind of guess what's going to look best. The middle of the frame, or the keyframe location, is where it's going to keep a solid object. So typically what it can do, so just be aware that sometimes if you're not getting the results you want, to just come in here and just start to play with some of these settings. Because you can start to go after, maybe your motion blur by is too much. Maybe you don't have enough motion steps. Okay? So that's that. So let's just take a look and see where this is at. So I'm just going to grab this, and I'm going to render just that region. You can see we have a little bit of blur right on the very end of it, a little bit less going up, a little bit less going up, and the very top of it right here, this area seems to be a bit blurrier, and even the plank is a bit blurrier. Here's the previous one, crystal clear. Here's that one. Now, even though this one as a frame isn't reading as nice and crisp and clear, it'll read a lot better on that animation because we have motion blur. Okay? When you watch movies, they have motion blur in them. All right? Yes, sir.
When you play blast, does it do a render as well?
It will when you render it. Okay? Not when you play blast it. Now we
You
can.
won't see the motion blur.
Not beforehand. We can preview it here. If I go to my viewport options under renderer, there's actually a motion blur inside here that I can enable. Oops.
Oh, okay, very cool.
And if I rewind it,
You didn't enable it.
I did. There's motion blur on it. Oops.
I was under the impression you
You
didn't.
can see it in the tail a lot.
Yeah, look right in the tail. And that's where we're going to get the most motion blur, is in the items that move the most.
Right.
That tail is moving the most. Okay? So some items you really, really need to have motion blur in order for it to read correctly. Think of like a helicopter blade. Animating a helicopter blade spinning, you could spin it 6 trillion times in a frame. It's not going to read unless there's motion blur, because that's what we're used to seeing. Okay? Now again, this is just preview just for fun. I don't typically need to have that on. All right. So now that we're here and we have some motion blur, I have some nice motion blur on this, I'm ready to render it out. When you render these, you're going to render two versions. One of them is with motion blur, one of them is without motion blur. Okay? So you'll be turning in one movie with both motion blur and non-motion blur, butt to butt. Or tail to butt. Alright, so I have motion blur turned on. I'm going to go to my common tab. I'm going to set my file name. So this one is with motion blur, so I'm going to call it Sarcona underscore stick underscore moblur. Okay? That way I know that this is my motion blurred version of this. Moblur. Mo better blur. And then I'm going to go down to the frame animation extension and set it to name.number.extension. I'm going to go to my start and end frame and set this to be 200. For my camera, I'm just going to use perspective in this case. But I want to make sure it's set up before I do anything else. So I'm going to click on, there's the resolution gauge. I'm going to click on that and just make sure this is set up. Okay? Make sure that it doesn't go past that resolution gate, which it's doing there. Okay, there it's doing it too. So pull back a little bit. Pull back a little bit.
Made it do the wiggle.
What are you doing here?
Right there.
What's he doing?
Maybe this thing with the frame.
Oh, okay.
There we go. So now we're not going to the very edge of it and going past that thing. Maybe right there a little bit. Nope. Whew, look at that.
So close.
Perfect. All right, so we're good with perspective. So I'm going to leave it there on perspective. 960 by 540 is the default. That's what we're going to leave that to. Under quality, I'm going to turn my overall quality up to 2. Okay? And then before I actually render, I'm just going to find a good frame with lots of motion. Remember we said that tail is going to have the most motion. So I'm going to find a good tail frame and render it out. And this should be a higher resolution one with with very little grain. Okay? If we still see a lot of grain, then I'm going to go into my lighting quality and turn my lighting quality up. But this should be what the end frames look like. Now, other things that we can do to kind of maximize our settings is that we can go through and grab items that are not motion blurred and tell motion blur not to be on them. Okay, like right now it's trying to calculate motion blur for the background. The background's not moving, so there's no reason to do that.
How would you single that out?
We just grab it and we turn it off. Say no motion blur for you. I grab him, attribute editor. And on his plane shape under render stats, no motion blur for you. See, it's that easy. Now looking at this, I see, okay, this looks okay, but I think I really want to be able to kind of pop this out just a little bit more. It's still not reading as well as I would like it to read. So I don't want to move my camera. Remember how finicky I was making sure it was lined up? I don't want to destroy my camera. So I'm going to go to the hotbox, go to Maya, and say New Camera, and watch what happens. Did you see it? It makes a brand new camera in the exact same spot. Okay, so now I can go to perspective and spin around, and I still have this camera here that I can use to render with and not destroy. Okay, so I'm going to hit S to set a key on that camera. It's locked in position. And now I can go over, zoom out and grab this. Now I only have one light in the scene. I'm going to duplicate that and scoot it over. And that means I'm also going to take both lights and decrease their intensities.
You're going to turn off shadows on the second line?
I may not have to. I'm going to see if I need to. Because they're so big, it may be spread out so far that we're not really going to see it. It may be just like this huge shadow that just kind of helps darken the background and pop us out a little bit more. Especially with the motion blur, we're really not going to see too much of that.
You said if still grainy at final render, bump up the lighting.
The lighting quality.
Lighting quality.
Yep. So we bumped up the overall quality. The slider right underneath it is lighting quality. Okay. Now this may sound counterintuitive also, but having some grain in your scene actually adds to it a little bit, because if you look at any video actually has grain to it. We can't get rid of it. Okay. So that doesn't look too bad. The other thing we can do is add another light behind it that kind of acts as a rim light, right? Just like in photo class. Okay. So if I added another light, duplicate this one, pull it behind it. Now, just so you can see what's going to happen with this light is behind this plane. It's actually cutting through the plane. So it's actually going to look horrible because we're going to have this big weird line right in the top right. And Maya will render starting at the bottom left and go up to that top point because that's the thing we want to see.
When you said if a shader for mental ray came up as a red, what does that mean?
Oh, mental ray is not loaded.
What if it says that it is loaded under the plugin?
It's lying.
Good call.
We'll look at it in a
Call
second.
the liar?
Yeah. So you can see right here, this top corner where it looks kind of funky. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this light and this surface, and under lighting and shading, I'm going to break the light links. Okay? So what that does is it breaks the lighting. That light is no longer going to light up that surface. Okay? So now if I go in here and I go back to my perspective 1, I render it again, I may get or should get something that has a little bit more of a line going around it. Alright, I think I'm going to darken this a little bit more. And don't be afraid to try stuff. Try darkening things, lighting things. Perspective 1. And just see if you get different results. I mean, obviously you can get different results, but just see if you're liking the different results.
I'm not liking.
So that doesn't look too bad. Darkening it is actually kind of helping it pop out a little bit more. The colors on that are a little bit lighter, so it's reading a bit better. So I darken it even more. Oh, you're seeing it horribly. There you go. So that looks pretty good. All right, so that's kind of like what I'm seeing on my screen up here. You can see that it's reading a lot better because the background's darker than that item. Okay? So don't be content with, I've added a texture, I've added some lights, and I should be done. Play with it until it starts to actually look good. Okay? There we go. So I'm happy with the way that's looking. So now I can go through my render settings again. Here's that lighting quality I was talking about, so maybe we want to up that a little bit. Okay? And then under common, I have to just go pick my new camera. Okay? So I'm just doing perspective 1. That's the only one I'm rendering through. Good. All right. So I go to render, I go to batch render option box. I turn off auto render threads and set this number to 12, and then hit batch render and close. And of course, save my scene.
That whole thing is dark.
Yes, it is.
Will it come out lighter on the render, you think?
Like that. So it makes, again, there's kind of ruining it. Every time I reset it.
I thought I was playing. Does that look bad for me?
There we go. About there. Okay. So there is about what I'm seeing or was seeing on my screen. All right. So now, once I've hit batch render, I go to right-click in the properties here. I go to Task Manager, and then I watch Maya, and I wait for Maya Batch. I wait for Maya Batch to get above 30. So right now it's at 97. So I'm happy. I let this thing go. There's render signs on the wall there. You can put one on your computer and let it go. Because we're the last class, you can let it go overnight. All right. It's always best to, before you're done, to right-click on it and set the priority below normal. If someone comes in, let's say it takes 30 hours to render for some reason. If someone comes in and they need to use the computer within that 30 hours, you want to make sure that it's not affecting them. So we just lower the priority on it. Okay? So pretending that this is completely done, I'm just going to end this. Then I'm going to go into my render settings. I'm going to turn off or delete the motion blur part. Go to my scene and turn off motion blur. And then re-render this whole thing again. Okay, that's how I get two versions of this, one with motion blur and one without motion blur. And it should be, again, it should be obvious because our motion blur one is going to look like that. Our non-motion blur one is going to look crisp and clear. Okay? Yes, sir.
Would you accept a duplicate in the same scene, one blurred, one not, and they run? No? Okay.
No.
Stop.
Because I want you to have the two separate videos there. Okay? So then you'll have two videos, and After Effects, you just put them together like that, and then it's good. Okay. If you have help or you need help with that part, I can walk you through that. But so that should be it. So after you're done with your animation, you're fine with the way it's looking, then start the rendering phase of texturing it, rendering it out, and then doing whatever. Now we do have other renderers on here, and if you're in other rendering classes or you want to play with other ones, feel free to. We do have V-Ray, it's not showing here. We do have V-Ray on these computers, so you could play with V-Ray, or you can play with RenderMan and see what you can get. I have limited experience in both, so a lot of it is just going to be you playing around with it, and me just kind of saying that's what you need. Yeah, there's Mental Ray, here's V-Ray, and there's RenderMan. Okay, so you can open up all those. And some of them will have different settings, so you just have to kind of play through and see what those different settings are. Okay? All right, so that's all I got for this one. Any questions on it? Negative. All right.